Greetings, traveler of the void. You have entered the domain of void-born terrors. Before we go any further, secure your Geller field. Subscribe to the archive. Strike the bell so the next transmission reaches you before the static does. Now dim the lumens, still your breath, and listen carefully. Because this is not a story of demons, bolter fire, or things with claws you can name. This is something quieter, older, and far worse. It begins with a mistake. A brass cylinder on the wrong shelf. A seal pressed into red wax 900 years ago. A file waiting with impossible patience for the one reader who was never supposed to open it. It is the story of an old scribe in the Obscurus Archivum, 61 years in service, who breaks protocol and opens a file he was never cleared to read. It is the story of a regiment that arrived exactly on time, at exactly the right world, only to reinforce a garrison that had already been dead for centuries. And it is the story of a single phrase, stamped across the cover in the flat, indifferent language of the Departamento Munitorum, lost in transit. Turn down the lights. The cylinder is already open. What follows is the first chapter of that account. Chapter 1. The file that should not have moved. I have spent 61 years filling the dead. Then one of them reached back. The file they gave me that morning was 200 years overdue for destruction. I was not supposed to read it. By the time I understood what it was, I had already read enough that stopping no longer mattered. This is my transcription. This is also my will. My name is Velgan Thorn, Adept Tertius of the Obscurus Archivum, Subsector Logothetics, Grade 8, assigned to Port Wander these 61 years. I am speaking into a cogitator spindle of the 7th pattern. Machine spirit placid. The chrono on my desk reads the 14th hour of the 3rd watch, the 217th day of 973.M41. I state these particulars because they are required. I state them also because, in a little while, I intend to verify them, and I suspect the verification will not proceed as I expect. I was once a younger man, with a wife, and a modest hab unit, and a machine-spirited tea-urn that knew the shape of my thirst better than my wife did. My wife is dead. The hab is someone else's. The tea-urn is here, beside me on the desk, and it is the only thing in the archivum older than I am that is still, in any meaningful sense, warm. I mention the tea-urn because it is, I realize, the thing I will miss. The archivum smells as it has always smelled, of corpse starch and oath paper dust, and the slow ozone tang of cogitator banks whose heat sinks have been running since before my grandfather's grandfather took the emperor's wafer. It is the smell of continuity. It is the smell of the Imperium doing what the Imperium does, which is remembering imperfectly, exhaustively, and without sentiment the names of its dead. We are not a library. A library preserves what is valuable. We preserve what has been filed. The cylinder arrived at the 11th hour, brought by runner scribe Ultric, who has the hunched, apologetic posture of a boy told since birth that his shoulders are an affront. He set it on my desk and said, "Misrouted from stack theta, Adept. Supervisor says you'll know what to do with it." I did not at that moment know what to do with it. Standard brass, the length of a forearm, capped in red wax at both ends, with the Munitorum sigil embossed, the pre-reform sigil. The Aquila's left wing canted at the old angle, which meant the cylinder had last been sealed no later than 5 centuries ago. I signed for it. I gave Ultric his chit. He left. I was alone with it. I want to be precise here, because I have reviewed these minutes in memory and I cannot find the moment at which I could have stopped. I would like to find such a moment. I cannot. By the time the cylinder was in my hands, the machinery was already turning. The machinery had been turning for 900 years. I read the cover stamp first. This is a procedure. The stamp read, Subject, 223rd Kossar Rifles, Light Infantry. Status, Lost in Transit. Contents, Final Testimony of the Officer of Record. Access Protocol, Vermilion. Priority, Deferred indefinitely. I read it once, then again, then a third time. After that, I poured myself tea from the urn older than my marriage and drank half of it, because I wanted to see whether my hand would tremble. My hand did not tremble. In 61 years, I have handled perhaps 800 vermilion files. I have not read one. You do not read a vermilion document unless a superior tells you to, and that superior must have been told by someone above him, who was told by someone above him, and so on up the chain, until the order reaches a height from which the reading will not, one hopes, kill the reader. That is what vermilion means. It means that once the document is read, the reader becomes part of the matter, a subject of interest to the ordinates of the Inquisition, to be processed accordingly. Processed accordingly. A soft phrase. A careful phrase. The administratum has always preferred its cruelty wrapped in polite language. Paragraph 14.7 of the Comitatus Praxis is perfectly clear. A misrouted vermilion file is to be resealed without examination, logged on Form 14 Delta, and delivered personally to the Adept Magister of the Watch. I know the rule well. I amended paragraph 14.7 myself in 947.m41. Then I opened the cylinder. I cannot fully explain why. It was not curiosity. Curiosity is a young man's weakness, and I have not been young for a very long time. What I felt was something closer to recognition. Holding that cylinder, I had the strange and terrible sense that I had been waiting for it, that somewhere in the long, pale accounting of my 61 years, a line had been left open for this exact morning. Now, I do not believe that feeling was mine. I believe it had been placed there. I believe now that the feeling was not mine. I believe it had been placed in me, like a weight set carefully onto a balance. I believe it had been moving toward me for 912 years. The wax broke with a small, dry crack, the sound of something that had waited long enough. Inside, I found three things. First, a voice spool, unlabeled, ribbon wound, the kind still preferred in frontline conditions, because warp interference has less chance of corrupting it. I set it aside. Second, a folded parchment log, officer's vellum, not pulp. The creases were still sharp. That troubled me immediately. Vellum stored in the archivum softens within 40 years. This had not softened. Whatever shelf it had rested on for the last 5 centuries, it had not spent those centuries here. And third, a brass dog tag on a broken chain. I held it up beneath the lumen strip. Krell, Ithaber, Lieutenant 223rd KSR, Kossar's Reach, AGR 061.M40. The tag was warm, not from my hand. I had only just touched it. This was a deeper warmth, a slow, patient heat, like a stone still holding the last of the day's sun long after sunset. It had been sealed inside a brass cylinder in the cold of Stack Theta for at least 5 centuries.
It should not have been warm.
I noticed that immediately, and in the small administrative voice that has kept me sane for 6 decades, I told myself it was simply a peculiarity, an anomaly to be noted later in the filing annotation. I did not note it. I unfolded the log. The handwriting was clerical and precise, clean strokes. The hand of an officer taught penmanship by someone who believed such things still mattered. The ink was Munitorum Regulation Black, with the faint blue undertone common to the ateliers of Cypramundi. Then I saw the date. I read it once, then again, Then a third time, 17th of Sextus, 061.M40. I began to transcribe. That too is procedure. Recovered documents are read aloud into the spindle, so the record survives in voice as well as in writing. I activated the cogitator, announced myself. Then I read the first entry exactly as it appeared. 17th of Sextus, 061.M40. Officer's log, Lieutenant Ithaber Krell, 223rd Cossa Rifles, in transit. The navigator informs us we shall make translation into the Vorlax system within the watch. 6 months subjective. Objective drift, per preliminary estimate, 20 to 30 days, within tolerance. Morale adequate. The men are tired of ship rations and eager, as men always are, to put their boots on something that does not hum. Our orders are routine reinforcement. I record that my men are in good order. I record that I have every confidence in them. I record that I am ready, as the Emperor made me ready, to do what is asked of me. Translation imminent. I paused the spindle. I drank. Then a thought occurred to me. An administrative thought, which unfortunately is exactly the kind of thought I am trained to obey. I opened the standing deployment ledger at my elbow. Guard deployments, segmentum obscurus, cogitator fed, current to the day. The ledger told me this: 223rd Cossar Rifles, raised, Cossar's reach, 058.M41, embarked, 021.M41, deployment order, Vorlax Secundus reinforcement, standing request, reference 39/144/VORS, disposition, lost in transit 223.M41, no recovery record. I read it a second time, then a third. The ledger said the 223rd Cossa Rifles had been raised in 058.M41. The log in my hand was dated 061.M40. A regiment raised in 058.M41 could not have produced an officer's log dated 061.M40. That was 963 years before the regiment existed. Lieutenant Krell had not been born. His father had not been born. Cossa's reach had not even been settled. I knew that without checking. The colonist charter was filed in 812 M40. I sat very still. Then I looked for the error. That is what men like me do when reality breaks. We look for the clerical mistake, the broken seal, the transposed digit, the misfiled record. And the Imperium gives us good reason to hope for such things. It is vast. Its paperwork is vaster. Errors spread through it the way rot spreads through wet grain. I wanted an error. I checked the vellum first. Cypra Mundi watermark. Batch 059.M40. Consistent with the date. The ink told me nothing. Regulation stock. Useless for dating. The parchment was worse. By the standard sealed storage ratio, it had aged exactly as it should have over approximately 912 years. 912 years before 973.M41 is 061.M40. The parchment had, in fact, been written in 061.M40. I was holding a document written 960 years before the men who wrote it had ever existed. I stopped the spindle. I want that noted. I addressed the cogitator directly, in my own voice, and not the transcriber's register, because I was still trying to force the situation back inside procedure. I said, "This entry is dated the 17th of Sextus, 061.M40. That is not possible. The 223rd deployed in 021.M41. I am reading a log that was written 960 years before it was written. The cogitator recorded me. The recording exists. Then I said the only thing left to say. I am going to continue. I looked at the summoning bell. I thought about Adept Magister Voss above me. 73 years old. Bad heart. Predictable habits. The sort of man who still believed the correct form in the correct tray could hold the universe together for one more day. I could have rung for him. I could have passed the matter upward. I could have been the man I had always been. A man who files correctly, goes home to an empty hab, and drinks his tea. But the log was warm, like the tag. That same slow, patient warmth. The warmth of something that was not supposed to be alive, and yet had not accepted the correction. And beneath that warmth, through my fingertips, I felt something else. Attention. That is the only word I have for it. The document was aware of me. Not in the way a man is aware. Not in the way a beast is aware. But it was fixed on me, as if it had spent 912 years moving through darkness toward one particular reader. If I had rung for Voss, the attention would not have vanished. It would only have passed through him on its way back to me. I am not noble. I did not spare him out of kindness. I spared him because I knew the document had come for me. There is no procedural apparatus in the Imperium that can defend a man from that. The Imperium runs on late mail. I had known that for 61 years. I had simply never understood what late truly meant. I restarted the spindle, announced the restart, stated the time. Then I frowned. The chrono read the 14th hour. I had begun at the 11th. I had not left my desk. I had paused by my own estimate for perhaps a quarter of an hour. 3 hours had passed. I said for the record, the chrono indicates 3 hours have elapsed. I do not account for 3 hours. I will continue. Then I turned to the second entry. The handwriting had changed, only slightly. The letters were tighter now, the strokes more controlled. The hand of a man trying very hard not to sound afraid. Every adept of my service knows that hand. The lumen strip above my desk, which had flickered perhaps 4 times in 6 decades, flickered now. Once, twice. A long third flicker, then the light steadied. And in that small pool of returning light, I looked down at Lieutenant Ithaba Krell's brass dog tag. It was warm again. Not fading warmth, not the last trace of heat left in cooling metal. Warmer than before, as though someone had only just taken it from around a living throat. Traveler of the Void, the first transmission is complete. An old scribe has opened a cylinder he was never meant to open. He has read a log written 9 centuries before the hand that wrote it was born. 3 hours have vanished, and he cannot account for any of them. And on his desk lies a dead man's tag, warm as if the dead man has only just stepped out of it. Lieutenant Krell's second entry still waits on the vellum, the landing on Vorlax Secundus, the garrison that should not exist, and a salute retired from Imperial service 4 centuries before the hand that gave it was ever born. If the dread has found somewhere permanent inside you, good. Let it stay there. Strike the seal of approval upon this chronicle, so the Emperor may witness it. Join the crew of Voidborn Terrors by subscribing to this archive. Strike the bell of notification, so the next transmission reaches you before the silence does. The file is open. The reader has been found. Come back for Chapter 2. Chapter 2. The Garrison That Answered. The first thing wrong with Vorlax Secundus was that nothing was wrong with it. The second thing was the salute. I read those 2 lines aloud into the spindle in Lieutenant Krell's hand, and then I stopped. Because that first line could only have been written after the fact. Krell could not have known, at the moment of planetfall, that the world would be wrong by being flawless. He could only have understood it later, after hours, perhaps days, spent looking for the obvious defect and finding none, and then realizing that the absence of a defect was the defect. I noted this in the margin of the transcript. Then I continued. 18th of Sextus, 061.M40. Planetfall on Vorlax Secundus, 0640 hours ship standard. The landing proceeded without incident. The orbital approach was unremarkable. Vorlax Secundus was a grey world, wrapped in cloud and siege haze, its atmosphere stained with the residue of old bombardments. A low amber shroud hung over the surface, thinning at the poles and thickening at the equator, where the fortress keep of Castellan Hask stood over the primary continent's only functional landing plateau. From orbit, the keep appeared exactly as the briefing slate described it. Hexagonal outer curtain, 6 bastion towers, central citadel of the late Ulanic school, no visible damage to the walls, no scarring on the landing plateau. 2 signal flares were launched from the eastern bastion as the transport approached. 3 green, 1 white. Exactly the friendly receipt pattern listed in the briefing. Everything was in order. They made ground fall at the designated pad. The pad had been freshly swept. Krell noted this. Freshly swept landing pads are not unusual. Garrisons expecting reinforcement prepare for arrival. He filed the observation under routine. Then Castellan Vorin Hask came out to meet them. He was flanked by 6 officers. Tall man, lean face, weather-beaten. The sort of officer who looked as though he had not slept properly in a year. His uniform was the deep iron grey of the Vorlac garrison, silver gorget at his throat marking his rank. He rendered the salute. Krell returned it out of reflex, one Imperial officer to another. And only after his hand drop did he realize that the salute Hask had given was not the one he had returned. It was the old salute, the pre-reform one, closed fist across the heart, thumb tucked under the knuckles, wrist turned inward, a gesture preserved only in Pict archives. It had been retired from Imperial service in 694 M39, 367 years earlier, and replaced with the open palm aquila. No living officer in the Obscurus segmentum should have been taught it. Krell assumed at first that it was a regimental eccentricity. That happens. Isolated garrisons keep strange habits alive long after the wider Imperium has discarded them. He filed it under regimental peculiarity, non-critical, and he said nothing. At that point, I stopped reading and spoke into the spindle in my own voice. The pre-reform salute was not merely retired in 694.M39, it was prescribed. The Administratum's doctrinal correction of that year classified it as a vestige of the Unification Wars, associated with loyalist cohorts whose methods had fallen out of favor. To render it in Imperial uniform after the prescription was minor heresy. A Castellan of the Obscurus segmentum would know that. A Castellan of the Obscurus segmentum would not offer that salute to a junior officer on a landing apron, unless he had been taught it when it was still correct, and had never been told otherwise. I let that sit on the recording. Then I continued. Hask welcomed the regiment with perfect courtesy. His officers were correct in bearing. The garrison band, a few fifers and a single drummer, played the 223rd Regimental March as the men disembarked. The march was correct, every note. Some of Krell's men had played it themselves back on Kosa's Reach. They knew it intimately. Corporal Vesk wept, discreetly, and no one reprimanded him. Krell noted the band. He also noted that the 223rd Regimental March was, to his knowledge, restricted to the regiment's own archives. A siege garrison that had never hosted the 223rd should not have possessed the music. He filed the observation under courtesy, anticipated. Perhaps Segmentum Command had transmitted it ahead of their arrival. Perhaps a signal had preceded them. He did not ask Hask where the music came from. He admits later that he believes he was afraid of the answer. The interior of the keep was as immaculate as the exterior. Clean corridors, lumen strips at perfect intervals, promethium from the outer defenses, incense from the chapel shrines, ration bread from the mess. All correct. Too correct. Too present. Krell lingered on the smell of promethium, and I understood why. In a real siege garrison, promethium does not smell like promethium. It smells contaminated, mixed with scorched lubricant, burnt propellant, the sweat of tired men, the sting of heat-cycled fuel and failing seals. A working fortress always smells slightly wrong, but the promethium on Vorlax Secundus smelled exactly like promethium, pure, instructional, the sort of smell a training manual would describe, as though the smell itself had been produced to match specification. Krell filed that under sensory anomaly, unspecified. He was filing many things under unspecified by then. I paused the spindle. I reached for my tea urn. The tea was cold. I had not noticed it going cold. Then I checked the chrono. It read the 16th hour of the third watch. It had been the 14th an hour ago. It had been 11 hours, 4 ago. I made a note. Second time loss event. 2 additional hours unaccounted for. I have been transcribing continuously. I have not slept. I have not rested. I have not, to the best of my knowledge, left this desk. I did not pull the bell. I continued. The garrison billeted the 223rd in the western barracks. The rooms were prepared, bedding fresh, water urns full. A welcoming ration set out in Krell's quarters, dark bread, hard cheese, and a portion of amasek. He ate it. He notes specifically that he ate it because, as he later understood, the eating mattered. The bread had the right shape, the right weight. The crust broke with the right sound. But inside, there was no crumb, no texture. It dissolved on the tongue the way bread is supposed to dissolve, in the way a manual might describe bread, but without the resistance of grain or the roughness of actual food. The cheese had no sharpness. The amasek had no burn. Each item was correct in form and absent in substance, as if someone had prepared a meal from a description rather than from reality and expected him to accept it on the strength of resemblance alone. He did accept it. He did not know what else to do. Later, he asked his men how the food had been. Every one of them gave the same answer. "Correct, sir." Corporal Vesk said it. Sergeant Drain said it. Private Holm, who under ordinary circumstances would have given 6 adjectives when one would do, said only, "Correct, sir," and nothing more. Krell did not press them, because by then he had understood one thing clearly. Correct was the only word the garrison permitted. I read that section twice. The second time, my voice wavered. I noted the waver in the transcript, because the transcript is the transcript, and a wavering voice is evidential. That evening, Krell attended a briefing with Castellan Hask in the command chamber. A vaulted stone room lit by lumen sconces, a long map table at its center. Hask described the enemy as a fragmented heretic warband, designation uncertain, unusually persistent. He said they had been assaulting the outer defenses for, and here Krell notes a pause, a considerable duration. Krell asked how long. Hask replied, "Long enough to know the rhythms." He did not give a number. Krell did not ask again. By that point, he had spent hours filing observations under unspecified and had developed, quite sensibly, an instinct for not forcing direct answers from people who clearly had no intention of giving them. The officers around Hask did not move while he spoke, not merely still in the disciplined manner of trained men. Still, no shifting of weight, no adjustment of posture, no blink. Krell counted. 4 minutes, no blink.
No.
He stopped counting because he did not want to know what would happen if he reached 5. Hask himself blinked once. Only once. And only when Krell began counting him specifically. As though he had remembered at that exact moment that blinking was something officers were supposed to do. After the briefing, Krell returned to his quarters and wrote the entry. He ended it simply. I am now going to sleep, because sleep is what an officer does at the end of his first watch on a new posting, and because I cannot think of anything else to do, the Emperor protects. I stopped the spindle. That entry ended there. The next entry was dated the 20th of Sextus. There was no entry for the 19th. An officer's log is kept daily. The absence of an entry is itself an entry. I made a note of that. Then I looked down at the dog tag on my desk. It was hot, not warm, not the patient warmth of before. Hot enough that when I touched it, and by that point I was touching things like a man does in a dream, I pulled my hand back immediately. The brass had a wet metal gleam in the lumen light, as though it was sweating. Then I looked up at the lumen strip above my desk. It was flickering, slowly, rhythmically. 3 pulses. Pause. 1 pulse. Longer pause. 3-1. 3-1. I am not a signals officer. I have never been trained in Vox code or lumen semaphore. But I have spent 61 years in the Archivum, and the Archivum holds the signal manuals of every Imperial service. I have read them for the same reason I have read most things, because reading is what I do. 3-1 in the standard Obscurus pattern is the Astra Militarum distress code for a garrison requesting immediate reinforcement. The lumen strip above my desk was signaling for reinforcement. I sat with that for some time. Then I said aloud, to no one my procedural mind could identify, I am not a reinforcement. The strip flickered. 3-1. I am a scribe. 3-1. I am 61 years old. I have never held a weapon. I would not know which end of a lasgun the power cell is connected to. I file, I transcribe, I annotate, I am not. 3-1. I stopped. Then I looked down at the open vellum log on my desk. Lieutenant Krell's handwriting. The next entry, 20th of Sextus, 061.M40. It began, I have no memory of the 19th. None of my men have any memory of the 19th. The logs have no record of the 19th, but the walls are cleaner than they were. We have been used. I read that line aloud into the spindle, and somewhere in the ventilation ducting above the Archivum ceiling, somewhere in the old brass pipework I had listened to for 61 years and never heard anything from except air, I heard it. A lasgun bolt being worked. Softly, clearly, once. Then a long, patient pause. Then again. The sound of a soldier at his post, checking his weapon on a slow watch. Above my head. Traveler of the Void, the second transmission is complete. Lieutenant Krell has made planetfall on a world that is correct in all its particulars and alive in none of them. A salute prescribed for 4 centuries. A regimental march that should not exist beyond the 223rd's own archives. Bread without crumb. Officers who do not blink. And a missing day the Garrison has somehow used. An old scribe in the Obscurus Archivum has now lost 4 hours to a document that will not let him go. The dog tag on his desk is hot. The lumen strip above him is signaling for reinforcement in a code no one in that room was ever meant to recognize. And something in the ducting above his head has begun working the bolt of a weapon that should not be there. If the dread has found a place in your chest, let it stay there. Strike the seal of approval upon this chronicle, so the Emperor may witness it. Join the crew of Voidborn Terrors by subscribing to this archive. Strike the bell of notification so that the next transmission reaches you before the static does. The file is open. The Garrison has been heard. Come back for Chapter 3. Chapter 3. What the Garrison is doing. 6 days. I have no memory of those 6 days. My men have no memory. The logs have no memory. But the walls are cleaner than they were. We have been used. I read that passage aloud into the spindle, and then I did something I have not done in 61 years of service. I stopped mid-entry. I turned the vellum over. I examined the back of it, because suddenly I needed to know whether there was anything there I had missed. At first, it looked blank. Then I saw it. In the lower right corner, faintly pressed into the parchment from the other side, was the outline of a thumbprint. Not written, impressed. As though the ink had been laid down with such force that the pressure itself had bitten through the vellum. The thumbprint was not Lieutenant Krell's. I knew that immediately. Krell's print was logged in the regimental records, and I have spent too many years among records not to recognize such things. Some men remember faces. I remember filing marks. This print belonged to me, not to a similar hand, not to some distant coincidence. Mine. The same whirl. The same split in the lower quadrant of the right thumb. The same mark I have pressed into more documents over 6 decades than I could ever count. It was my thumbprint, pressed into the back of a log written 912 years before I was born. I placed my thumb against it. It fit exactly. I withdrew my hand, set the vellum down, reached for my tea. The tea urn was cold. That machine-spirited urn had never gone cold. Not in a power failure, not in winter, not in the deep hours of the watch when the stone itself felt dead. It had always remained warm. It was one of the smallest mercies of my life, and I had been fool enough to rely on it. Now it was cold. I set the cup down. Then I returned to Krell's log. 20th of Sextus, 061.M40. Morning muster. His men were still at their posts. As far as any of them could tell, they had been at their posts for 6 straight days. No one reported hunger. No one reported exhaustion. Corporal Vesk's beard had not grown. Private Holmes' cut, a small wound he had taken during disembarkation, had not healed. It had not closed, had not scabbed. It remained exactly as fresh as it had been on the 18th. Krell asked Sergeant Drain what they had done during those 6 days. Drain answered, "We held the line, sir." Krell asked for specifics. Which wall? Which bastion? Which assault? What hours had they slept? What rations had they drawn? Drain looked at him with the polite confusion of a man being asked to explain a color. Then he repeated, "We held the line, sir." Krell did not press him. Watching the man's face, he understood that the question was not reaching the part of the mind where answers are formed. It was being received somewhere shallower, somewhere administrative, processed, returned with the correct response attached. Drain was not lying. Drain was not even confused. He was producing the only output his situation allowed, and then Krell realized something worse. That had been the only output any of his men had produced in 2 days. He writes, "I am not certain they were still my men." The handwriting changed there, tighter, faster. The ink gathered at the ends of the strokes, as though the quill had been gripped too hard by a man who could not afford to let his hand tremble. I read it aloud and kept my own voice level. Above me, in the ventilation ducting of the archivum, the soft mechanical sound of a laser gun bolt being worked had been joined by another, then another. 3 weapons, 4. They were not in rhythm with one another. They came staggered, like sentries posted along a wall, each man checking his weapon on his own slow watch. I did not look up. I continued. Krell went to the Castellan. The command chamber was empty when he entered, which disturbed him at once. Hask was always there at that hour. The map table was his altar. He tended it like a priest tends a reliquary. But now he was gone. Krell stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and looked down at the map. And the map was wrong. Not the placements, not the formations, the map itself. It showed the fortress, the outer curtain, the 6 bastions, the landing plateau and the siege works beyond the walls. All of that was correct, but inside the walls, within the western barracks where the 223rd had been quartered, the map showed enemy positions. Heretic picked markers, arranged in a defensive cordon, inside their own fortress. The 223rd Kosa rifles were marked on the map as the enemy. Krell was still staring at it when Hask entered behind him. Hask did not see him at first. Krell was partially concealed by the pillar near the map table, and so for perhaps 5 seconds, he watched the Castellan behave as though he were alone. Hask stepped to the map, lifted one of the enemy markers, moved it carefully from the western barracks to the corridor leading toward the mess hall. The way a man moves a game piece mid-turn. Then without turning, he said, "Lieutenant Krell, you are early to the briefing." Krell stepped out. Hask was smiling. A small, professional smile. The sort a senior officer gives a junior whose initiative he approves of. He said, "I assume you have questions." Krell said, "The map, sir. My men are marked as enemy positions." Hask looked at the map, looked back at Krell, and said, with mild and genuine puzzlement, "Of course they are. What else would they be?" I read those words into the spindle and heard them come out of my own mouth, as though someone else was speaking through me. Then, above me in the ducting, a voice cleared its throat. Softly, politely. The sound of a soldier on watch remembering that his throat had gone dry. I did not look up. I continued. Krell asked Hask to explain, and Hask did. Krell records the explanation with unusual care, and I understand why. It may be the single most important thing he ever learned. Hask said, "A siege is a pattern. 2 parties, those who defend, those who assault. The defenders fire from the wall, the attackers fall in the field. Then dawn comes. The attackers rise in the same places. The defenders fire again. Repeat it long enough," he said, "and the pattern stops being an action. It becomes a structure, a thing in itself, independent of the living men who once performed it. The pattern wants to continue, and when one side weakens, when one side runs out of bodies or will or memory, the pattern reaches for replacements. It draws in new participants, assigns them their roles." Krell asked when Vorlak had fallen. Hask answered, M3 9.744, 190 years earlier, by his own most recent reckoning. Krell said, "We are in M40.061. Hask replied, "Yes, you are." Krell asked how he could still be alive. Hask smiled again, and this time he answered plainly. He was not alive. None of them were. The siege had fallen, the garrison had died, but the pattern had not ended. 9 centuries of reinforcement requests, filed and refiled and left pending, had tightened the loop too far to let it break, so the dead remained at their posts. The enemy rose every dawn. The request for reinforcement continued to move through the machinery of the Imperium. Eventually, somewhere in that machinery, it was received, processed, filled. Then Hask looked at Krell with something like pity and said the thing that matters most. "You are the reinforcement, Lieutenant. You and your men. You were summoned. You were not deployed." Krell asked what their purpose was. Hask told him the pattern rotates. The garrison grows tired. The enemy grows tired. Fresh bodies are always required. The enemy in the fields, the grey men cut down each dawn, were not a separate army. They were the previous garrisons, used up on the walls, rotated into the role of attacker. When Hask's garrison was spent, they too would walk down into the fields. And when the 223rd was spent, they would do the same. And after them, another reinforcement would come, and another, and another. Then Hask said, "Welcome to Vorlak Secundus, Lieutenant. The siege thanks you for your service." I stopped the spindle, and I sat there in the Obscurus Archivum, with the cold tea urn on my right and the hot dog tag on my left, and the vellum on my blotter bearing my own thumbprint pressed through from the wrong side. Above me, perhaps 20 men were working the bolts of their laser guns in the ducting, softly, patiently, in watch rhythm. And one of them had cleared his throat. Then I understood. I understood what the 223rd Kosa rifles had been. I understood what they had been used for. And I understood why the log had traveled 912 years to reach me. The pattern was not merely a siege. The siege was only one expression of it. The real pattern was larger. It was the Imperium itself. 10,000 years of reinforcement requests, filed for places already dead. 10,000 years of deployment orders sent to destinations long since destroyed. 10,000 years of the administratum grinding forward, completing transactions for hands no longer alive to receive them. The Imperium does not run on late mail. The Imperium is late mail. Somewhere inside that machine, a request had remained pending for 900 years. It had been routed, rerouted, misshelved, found again, and finally this morning it had reached my desk, not to inform me, to fill me, to take me in the way it had taken Krell. The file was not a file. The file was a requisition, and I had been requisitioned. The men in the ducting above me were not intruders. They were my garrison, the ones who had come before me, waiting, with the soft courtesy of soldiers who have waited a very long time for their lieutenant to come up and take his post. Krell's log continued. One final entry, 21st of Sextus, his last. The handwriting was steady now. He had made his decision. I read the opening line aloud. "At dawn, we will not fire. We will refuse the pattern. If this is my last entry, remember that the 223rd chose not to serve. Remember us as heretics if you must. Remember us." I set the vellum down. Above me, the sound of working bolts stopped. All at once, perfectly synchronized, every weapon held at the ready, waiting. And then, very softly, very politely, in the calm voice of an officer who had been waiting his entire afterlife for this moment, someone in the ducting above me said, "Stand to. Traveler of the Void, the third transmission is complete. An old scribe has finally understood the shape of the machine he serves. A dead Castellan has explained the geometry of a siege that feeds on its own reinforcements, century after century, request after request, wall after wall. Lieutenant Krell has made his choice. At dawn, the 223rd Kosa rifles will refuse the pattern. They will not fire. And in the Obscurus Archivum, in a ventilation duct that should carry only air, a dead garrison has been called to stand to. If the dread has made a room for itself in your chest, let it stay there. Strike the seal of approval upon this chronicle, so the Emperor may witness it. Join the crew of Voidborn Terrors by subscribing to this archive. Strike the bell of notification, so that the next transmission reaches you before the silence does. The file is a requisition.
The reader has been drafted.
Come back for Chapter 4. Chapter 4. The Refusal. At dawn we did not fire. At dawn, the enemy did not advance. At dawn, the garrison turned as one and looked up at us on the wall. And in that moment, I understood the truth. The loop had two roles, and we had just taken the other one. I read those lines into the spindle in my own voice, but in Lieutenant Krell's hand. Then I reached the next line and stopped. Because the next line was not written in Krell's hand. It was written in mine. I want that stated clearly for the record. The entry dated the 21st of Sextus, 061.M40, continued for several more paragraphs. The first three lines were in Krell's script, clean and disciplined. The fourth began in his hand, continued for a few words and then changed. Not abruptly, not like a forgery, more like one scribe taking over from another in the middle of a sentence. By the middle of the line, the writing was mine. My hand, my formation, the leftward slant of my lowercase r, the tight return of my G descender, which my calligraphy instructor criticized in 923.M41 and which I kept out of sheer stubbornness. I had not written it. I had not held the quill. I had not touched the vellum with any instrument. I had been sitting at my desk, reading into the spindle for what the chrono claimed was 8 hours, though I could not account for perhaps 5 of them, and yet the writing was mine. So I read it, because reading was the only thing left to me. Because I am what I am, and what I am reads things into spindles. And because by then, stopping no longer felt like something I was permitted to do. The next passage read, "The grey men in the field stopped at the base of the wall. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They simply stood there, raised their heads, and looked up. Their faces were wrong in a very specific way. They were not faces I knew. They were faces I felt I was supposed to know. Men who might have served under my father, if my father had served. Men who might have drilled my grandfather on a world that, at the time, did not yet exist. Faces assembled from memory and lineage rather than life. Approximations. Administrative versions of men. Then Castellan Hask stepped out from the wall, not through the gate. The gate remained closed. He walked through the stone itself, through dressed blocks worn smooth by 9 centuries of siege, as though the wall were no more solid than a curtain. He emerged into the field below, turned and looked up at Krell. He was not smiling now. He said, "Lieutenant Krell, the 223rd Kossa Rifles has declined its role. The pattern acknowledges the declination. The pattern provides for declination. There is a secondary protocol." Krell asked, "What protocol?" Hask answered, "Relief." Neither Krell nor his men understood him. Corporal Vesk, standing beside him on the firing step, whispered, "What does he mean, sir?" Krell did not answer, because by then not knowing had begun to feel like a kind of mercy. Instead, he said to Hask, "Explain." And Hask did. "The garrison of Vorlac Secundus has held this wall for 912 years, he said. "We are tired, Lieutenant. We are very, very tired. The pattern permits relief when the relieving unit declines the attacking role. Your refusal to fire is not a heresy, it is a request. You have requested the garrison post. The pattern grants the request. Then something happened in the field below that would have sounded ceremonial, even noble, if it had not been so horrifying. Hask's garrison, the grey men Krell had believed were the enemy, raised their rifles, not toward the wall, not toward the defenders, toward themselves. They held them in the posture of a unit rendering honors to its successor. Hask looked up and said, "Take the wall, Lieutenant. The enemy is in the fields. You will understand the rhythms." Then he laid his rifle at Krell's feet. He was 40 feet below the parapet. No motion carried the weapon upward, no throw, no arc, no visible passage through the air. One moment, it was in Hask's hands. The next it rested beside Krell's boot on the firing step, still warm. Then Hask stepped backward, and time caught him. 912 years struck him in the space of a breath. His uniform did not collapse. There was nothing left to collapse. He simply unmade, returned to dust, to reckoning, to whatever remained after the pattern was finally done using him. And all behind him, the grey men began to do the same, rank after rank, century after century, garrison after garrison, all at once. They dissolved in a long whispering collapse, like wheat flattened by a sudden wind. They were being released, not defeated, released, because the 223rd had refused to fire. For one moment, the field below the wall stood empty. Then the gate of the fortress opened, and from inside the keep, from the same barracks where the 223rd had slept, from the same mess where they had eaten food that was all form and no substance, from the same shrines where incense had smelled correct and nothing else, another force emerged into the field. Grey men, in 223rd uniforms, with 223rd faces. The rotation had taken place. The pattern had not broken. It had merely advanced to the next stage. The 223rd Kossa rifles were now the garrison, and the enemy they had just been issued was themselves. I read that into the spindle in a level voice. I do not know how the voice remained level. Perhaps after 61 years of reading impossible things aloud, the voice develops a discipline separate from the body. Above me in the ducting, the dead garrison resumed working the bolts of their laser guns. Faster now, not idle watch rhythm, preparation, the sound of men receiving orders. I continued. At first, Krell's men did not understand what they were seeing. Then Corporal Vesk saw one of the advancing figures in the field. It wore his face. He stared at it and said, in a small, stunned voice, "Sir, that man has my face." Then he fired. A reflex. A rifleman's horror made into action. The lasbolt struck the figure in the chest. The figure fell, and on the parapet beside Krell, Vesk fell too. No wound, no mark. He simply dropped, as though some principle that had been holding him upright had been withdrawn. In that instant, Krell understood everything. The men in the field were not copies, not doubles, not tricks. They were the same men. The pattern had assigned two roles to one regiment, defenders on the wall and attackers in the field. To fire on the enemy was to fire on themselves. To refuse to fire was to be overrun by themselves. There was no correct action. That is the horror at the center of it. Not merely that the pattern continued, that it had removed the possibility of a right decision. The refusal had not broken the cycle. It had only changed how the cycle consumed them. Krell ordered his men to hold their fire. Most obeyed. Sergeant Drain obeyed. Private Holm obeyed. They stood with lowered weapons and watched their own faces advance through the field toward the wall, each man wearing the stillness of someone who has understood that the price being asked of him is impossible to pay. Then the pattern answered. The walls softened. That is the only word for it. The parapet beneath Krell's hand lost its certainty. Not collapse, not a fracture. Something worse. It yielded slowly, as though it had only ever been pretending to be stone and had now decided to stop pretending. His fingers sank into it. Holmes' rifle barrel sank into the firing step. The entire wall was losing its conviction. And in the field below, the advancing duplicates did not hurry. They did not need to. The wall was coming down to meet them. Krell picked up the rifle Hask had left for him. It was the only object on that parapet that still possessed proper weight. And he understood why. It was the pattern's weapon, the commander's weapon. The one thing in the whole fortress permitted to remain solid. because the role it served had never lapsed. He raised it, and he did not fire. There was nowhere to fire, not at the duplicates, not at his own men, not at the wall, not in the sky. Every possible target already belonged to the pattern. So he did the only thing left that still resembled duty. He dropped the rifle, turned from the wall, and ran. He ran to the comms bunker. He makes a point of clarifying this, and I preserve the point exactly. He did not run out of cowardice. He ran because one function remained open to him, and it was the one function the pattern had not yet foreclosed. Record, testify, file the truth, get it off the world and into the great grinding mail system of the Imperium, in the desperate hope that one day it might reach a reader capable of doing something with it. At the time, he did not know who that reader would be. He knows now. I stopped the spindle there. The handwriting had been mine for 3 paragraphs. Then, in the final section, it changed back to Krell's. Clean, steady. The hand of a man who had done the thing he had resolved to do. I read the final passage. He reached the comms bunker. The equipment was still functional. The pattern had preserved it. After all, a request for reinforcement cannot continue if the means of sending it breaks. Krell sat at the console, prepared the message torp, uploaded the log and voice spool, then addressed the routing header, not to Segmentum Command, not to any authority that might be expected to intervene. He addressed it to the adept who, by mischance or by design, would one day be the one to read it. He wrote, "I do not know you, reader. I know only that you will exist. I know only that the warp will deliver this to you. I know only that some chain of misshelvings and clerical errors and quiet administrative sins will carry this cylinder across 9 centuries, until at the end of that chain, it comes to rest on a desk, and on that desk, you will open it. I am sorry. I am sorry for the hours you have already lost. I am sorry for the warmth of the tag. I am sorry for what you have understood, and for what you will understand, and for what you cannot now ununderstand. I am sorry that I cannot warn you more plainly. The pattern constrains what I can say. If I write the warning too clearly, the pattern will not permit the document to travel. So I must write, as a dying man writes a will, in careful, useful language, the sort a stranger can file. I will tell you only this. What the pattern did to us, it has done before. What it did before, it is doing to you now. The Archivum is not what you believe it to be. It has not been what you believe it to be for some time. The garrison above your ceiling is not a metaphor. They are waiting for you, reader. They have been waiting for a very long time. They will not harm you. They will not need to. The pattern will provide. When you understand this, it will feel as if you have a choice. You do not. The pattern will already have chosen. I chose to send this. I chose to write your name into the ledger of those I am responsible for. I chose to be the one who warned you, knowing that the warning itself would be the summons. I am sorry for that also. Please do not send reinforcements. Ithaba Krell, Lieutenant. 223rd Kosa Rifles. The pattern thanks you for your service. The log ended there. The vellum beneath the signature was blank, and I sat at my desk in the Obscurus Archivum and listened. Then, from the ducting above me, the soft, courteous voice of an officer I had never met called down in the calm tone of a command rehearsed for 9 centuries. Adept Thorn, if you would come up, please. We are ready for you now. And then, finally, I understood. The cylinder on my desk had not been misrouted. It had arrived, precisely on time. Traveler of the Void, the 4th transmission is complete. Lieutenant Krell is dead. The 223rd Kosa Rifles is dead. And yet it is still the garrison. Still the enemy. Still the fuel. The pattern rotates, and it never runs dry. The Imperium files the requests, the pattern fills them, and the fuel is always delivered. The fuel is always us. And now, in the Obscurus Archivum, a 61-year-old scribe has heard his own summons, called from the ducting overhead. In the same calm, formal tone he has spent a lifetime preserving in manuals and records. The voice of a superior officer welcoming relief at last. If the dread has soaked into the walls around you, let it stay there. Strike the seal of approval upon this chronicle, so the Emperor may witness it. Join the crew of void-born terrors by subscribing to this archive. Strike the bell of notification, so that the next transmission reaches you before the stand to does. The pattern has been filed. The reinforcement has been called. The final chapter waits. Come back for chapter 5. Chapter 5. The Reviewer Protocol. The regulations are very clear. A scribe who encounters a live document is required to file a Form 7 Omega, document classification anomaly, reader contaminated, and report immediately to his supervising adept magister for relocation and memory scour. I filled out the form. I am holding it now. I have been holding it for 1 hour and 41 minutes. No one has come. I want the record to show that I followed procedure. I want that particularly. I want it preserved in my own voice, in the calm register of a man who did his duty in a situation that no longer permitted duty to matter. The moment the voice in the ducting spoke my name, I set down the vellum. I capped the ink. I opened the lower left drawer of my desk and withdrew a blank Form 7 Omega in the proper order. I dated it, filled in my own name in the reader field, catalogued the document, 223rd Kossar Rifles, recovered cylinder, provenance, Vorlax Secundus, classification, live. Then I noted the protocol violation, my own, and I signed it. After that, I pulled the summoning bell. The bell is a brass cord running up through the ceiling of my cell, through 3 intermediate levels, into the office of Adept Magister Voss. Original installation. In 61 years, I had pulled it perhaps 11 times. Each pull produced a small chime in Voss's office, loud enough to interrupt a conversation, but not loud enough to startle a resting man. Within 5 minutes, a runner scribe would arrive with instructions. I pulled the bell, and the cord came down into my hand. All of it, the entire length, frayed at the end in soft white fibers, neatly severed by something sharp and patient. I looked at the cut end for some time. Then I said into the spindle, "The bell cord has been cut. I do not know when. I pulled it approximately 30 seconds ago, and it came free in my hand." I coiled the cord on the desk. Then I stood, and I walked to the door. The door of my cell opens onto the 7th stack level of the Obscurus Archivum, a corridor perhaps 400 meters long, lined with the cells of 27 other adepts of my grade. That corridor is never empty. The Archivum runs continuously. There is always someone moving through it. A runner, a sub-magister, an adept returning from refectory. Always. I opened the door. The corridor was dark, not dim, not reduced operational lumen. Dark. The lumen strips were gone. Not off. Gone. Their housings remained in the ceiling. Brass frames, ceramic sockets. But the strips themselves had been removed long ago. The sockets were dust-choked, empty for years. I looked farther down the corridor. 40 meters away, it ended in rubble. Not closed. Collapsed. The 7th stack level was not whole. It was a ruin. The cells on either side of the hall, cells that had once contained my colleagues, men and women, whose names I could have recited without effort, had caved inward. Doors hung loose on broken hinges. Their interiors were dark with the specific darkness of rooms that have not been entered in years. The air was still, cold, and it smelled of powdered parchment. That smell I knew. It is the smell of archives where documents are allowed to die because no one remains to reshelve them. I stood in the doorway for a long time. Then I said into the spindle, "The Archivum's 7th stack level has been abandoned. I do not know for how long. I will attempt to establish a time frame." Then I returned to my desk. I sat down, and I looked at the chrono. It was a fine instrument. Standard Munitorum issue, Mark 9. Mechanical escapement. Secondary cog counter for larger Imperial cycles. I had maintained it myself for 31 years. It had never drifted by more than 2 minutes. The main face read, 19th hour of the 3rd watch, 217th day of 973.M41. I consulted the secondary cog counter. It read, 412.M42. 439 years. I had been sitting at that desk, transcribing aloud from a vellum log for 439 years. I read that fact into the spindle, and I did not scream. I did not pray. I did not break. There was nothing in me left that knew how to do those things. The ordinary human responses had been spent long before. What remained was the part of me shaped by 61 years of service. And that part of me had no mechanism for grief on the scale of 4 centuries. It simply noted the figure and recorded it. So I said, 439 years have elapsed during the transcription. The cogitator banks are inoperative. The staff have been departed for an indeterminate period. I am, to all appearances, alone. I was not alone. And sitting there, with the ruined corridor beyond my cell and the ducting overhead, I finally understood what had happened to me. I had been wrong about the document. Not in any of the facts. The facts were all true. Lieutenant Ithaba Krell had existed. The 223rd Kosa Rifles had existed. The siege of Vorlax Secundus had existed, and in some terrible way still did. The warp had carried Krell's final testimony across 9 centuries of misshelving and bureaucratic drift until it reached my desk on the morning of the 217th day of 973.M41. But the document was not a warning. Krell believed it was. He wrote it as one, and that mattered. Because a warning that knows it is bait does not work as bait. It has to be honest. The fear must be real. The apology must be real. The grief must be real. Only then can the document perform its actual function, which is not to warn. It is to summon. Krell had been the message torp. The pattern had launched him into the warp 900 years earlier, loaded with his own honest testimony, trusting that authentic sorrow is the most reliable guidance system the pattern possesses. An honest message travels farther. Clerks are reluctant to destroy sorrow, and sorrow reaches its target. The target in this case was me. Not me in particular. Any senior adept might have served. Any disciplined scribe with enough years, enough habits, enough devotion to transcription over alarm. The pattern did not require Velgan Thorn. It required a reader, a man who, faced with a live document, would read it aloud before he did anything else. That was the function. Krell was the summoner, and 900 years ago, believing he was trying to save some unknown future reader, he sealed an apology into the warp and guaranteed that the reader would arrive exactly where the pattern needed him. The honesty of the message was its routing instruction. The sorrow was the postage. The apology was the seal. I had opened it. I had read it aloud for 439 years, and in reading it, I had become the reinforcement the pattern had called for, not for Vorlak's wall. That wall had long since settled its own accounts. For another wall, a quieter one, a wall shaped not like stone battlements, but like records, shelves, cells, and ducts. The Obscurus Archivum. At last, I understood what Krell had meant. The garrison above your ceiling is not a metaphor. The Archivum had not been a building for a very long time. It had been a position, a post, a wall wearing the shape of an archive because the man it was waiting for was a scribe. If it had been waiting for a pilot, it might have taken the shape of a cockpit. If it had been waiting for a soldier, a trench. The pattern takes the shape its fuel requires, and I was the fuel. I had been the fuel since the 11th hour of that morning, 439 years earlier, when a nervous runner scribe named Ultric, who I now understood, had only been another temporary shape the pattern wore, placed a brass cylinder on my desk and left it for me to open. I sat with that. I did not weep. I did not rage. At my age, or at whatever strange age I had become by then, the ordinary emotional responses were no longer available to me. So I looked instead at the voice spool. Krell had sealed it in the cylinder with the vellum and the dog tag. I had not played it. The transcription protocol did not require it. The spool was only corroboration, and the written log had been enough. Until now. So I played it. The spool loaded into the secondary cogitator with a soft, dry click. The ribbon began to move. The audio emerged through the Vox horn. It was not Krell's voice. It was mine. My voice. My cadence. My exact transcription register. The same pace. The same pronunciation. The same controlled, even tone I had been using since the beginning of the reading. The spool had been sealed in a brass cylinder 9 centuries ago, and yet it contained a recording I had made that morning. Both things were true. The pattern had closed. I listened to myself for nearly a minute. Somewhere beneath my own voice, in the background of the spool, I could hear it. A faint, regular sound. A laser bolt being worked. Not above me. Behind me. Within the recording. I was already in the ducting. I had been in the ducting for some time. I stopped the spool. Then I leaned toward the spindle and spoke one final time. For the adept who finds this, I am Velgan Thorn. I was Adept Tertius of the Obscurus Archivum, subsector Logothetics, grade 8. I believed I was 61 years in the service. The figure may be larger. I have transcribed the final testimony of Lieutenant Ithaba Krell of the 223rd Kossa Rifles, recovered from a misshelved brass cylinder at the 11th hour of the 217th day of 973.M41. The transcription took me, by my own reckoning, between 8 hours and 439 years. I am unable to resolve the variance. I want to tell you not to read what I have transcribed. I cannot. The pattern will not permit that warning. If I state it too plainly, the document will fail to reach you, and someone else will be taken in your place. The calculation favors you. I am sorry for this. You will believe you are reading the document. You will not believe you are inside it. That belief is the first thing the pattern builds in you. I had it too. I had it even after the chrono informed me that 439 years had passed during the reading. I can tell you only what I was told. Please do not send reinforcements. I am sorry, I am so very sorry. The pattern thanks you for your service. Then I stopped the spindle and looked up. The ventilation grill above my desk was open. I do not remember opening it. The screws lay on my blotter in a neat row, arranged by the patient hand of a man who had spent a lifetime organizing small things on flat surfaces. From the grill, a hand descended. Not threatening, not grasping. An offered hand. A gloved hand in the iron grey of the Vorlak Garrison. At the wrist, a Castellan's rank pip. Then, in the soft voice of a man who had waited 900 years to speak, Castellan Vorin Hask said, "Welcome to your post, Adept. The enemy is in the stacks. You will understand the rhythms. I took his hand. I climbed. The spindle continued to record. It recorded the scrape of the chair being pushed back. It recorded the sound of my breathing for a moment. Then it did not. It recorded the small metallic click of the grille closing from the inside. And then, for a very long time, it recorded only silence. The silence of an empty cell in an abandoned archive, on a world the Imperium had long since forgotten it possessed, until the door opened, and a runner scribe entered, a boy with bent shoulders and an apologetic posture, a brass cylinder in his hands. He set it on the desk and said to the empty chair, "Misrouted from Stack Theta, Adept. Supervisor says you'll know what to do with it." Then he left. The cylinder sat there, and from the ducting above it, in the patient, courteous rhythm of soldiers at their posts, a newer garrison, one that now included me, began very softly to work their bolts. The file is open. The reader has not yet arrived, but the reader is coming. The reader is always coming. The Imperium runs on late mail. Then, appended to the recovered cylinder in the archaic ink and script of a pre-reform Munitorum clerk, there appeared one final notation. Subject: Thorn Velgan Adept Tertius. Disposition: Lost in Transit. Enclosure: Final Testimony, Reader of Record. Reviewer: Protocol, Vermilion, Filing. Priority: Deferred Indefinite. Note to Receiving Adept. There are 19 more cylinders on this desk. They have not yet been read. They are waiting. That was Volume 1. Traveler of the Void, the final transmission is complete. An old scribe has climbed into the ducting. A Castellan dead for 9 centuries has welcomed him to his post. The archivum that was never truly an archivum has received its reinforcement, and the Imperium's late mail has arrived exactly on schedule. Krell's warning reached its reader. The warning was the summons. The summons was the reinforcement. The reinforcement was the fuel, and the fuel was always us. Somewhere now, on some desk, in some cell, at some quiet hour of some future morning, another brass cylinder is already on its way. Routed by 9 centuries of misshelving and clerical sin toward an adept who has not yet heard the runner scribe's step, has not yet touched the wax seal, has not yet heard the small dry crack of something that has been waiting. The pattern does not end. It rotates. There are 19 more cylinders on the desk. Volume 2 has already been filed. And somewhere, another reader is already being called. If this chronicle has made a permanent room for itself inside you, if in the long dark hours you find yourself listening to the ducting above your ceiling for a sound you had never noticed before, then do this. Strike the seal of approval upon this chronicle, so the Emperor may witness it. Join the crew of Voidborn Terrors by subscribing to this archive. Strike the bell of notification so that the next transmission reaches you before the cylinder does. We will return. We always return. The Imperium's mail is late, but it is never lost. Voidborn Terrors. The file is open. The reader has been found. The pattern thanks you for your service.